So as a prelude to talking about combined live viral vaccines like MMR, I just want to talk a bit about the history and what we understand about concurrent viral exposure. In other words, exposure to more than one virus at the same time. So the factors influencing the outcome from measles infection in children, as we've discussed, include age of exposure, extremely important, and the intensity of the exposure, two related factors. And just by way of an historical perspective, studies that we did with Dr. Anders Ekbom in Uppsala in Sweden many years ago showed that children born during epidemics of measles were at greater risk of Crohn's disease. We then went further and looked at whether a pregnant mother suffered measles during that pregnancy. Now, measles during pregnancy is extremely unusual because the vast majority of people in Europe had been exposed to measles as children. It was very rare, and in central Sweden at that time there were 4 cases of maternal exposure to measles. What was fascinating about that is that 3 of the offspring of those mothers developed severe Crohn's disease, but not until the age of 30. So there was a clear relationship between this atypical pattern of exposure to measles during pregnancy or very early in life and the development of later Crohn's disease. And then Darrell Pardee and his colleagues from the Mayo Clinic went further and showed that if you'd suffered measles under 5 years of age, then you had an increased risk of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, a related inflammatory bowel disease. Now, inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's have suffered a dramatic increase in their incidence. That's the number of new cases occurring in populations with time, just as we've seen for autism. And this graph shows countries across the world with a dramatic increase, a parallel rise in the incidence of Crohn's disease, a similar epidemic pattern suggesting an environmental common denominator. And it may well be that the changing pattern of exposure to measles virus is part of that. So the factors that influence the outcome from measles infection include not only age of exposure and intensity of exposure, but we suggested some years ago concurrent viral infection. In other words, if you have measles but you have it with another infection at around the same time, it's not the same thing, that one virus alters the body's response to the second virus. And so we put forward the hypothesis that the interaction of measles with another virus might be a risk factor for inflammatory bowel disease, that is Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. At the time in the UK we had an extremely valuable resource that is called the 1970 British birth cohort. All children born in 1 week of 1 year followed all of their lives, and so you were able to look at childhood factors, maternal factors that might influence diseases that didn't develop for many, many decades. And in that group we were able to look at the pattern of wild-type measles infection and inflammatory bowel disease. So this is before vaccination, this is wild-type infection. We were able to study infections from birth to age 10. And the infections for which data were available were measles, mumps, pertussis, chickenpox and meningitis, albeit that meningitis is not a specific infectious agent. The age of infections were ascertained in interview with parents when the children were 10 years of age and before they developed any symptoms of inflammatory bowel disease, so there was no bias in the reporting according to whether the inflammatory bowel disease was present or not. Multiple infections during 1 year of life turned out to be a risk factor for inflammatory bowel disease. 2 or more infections within the same 12-month period, that was the smallest unit of time that was available to us, were a significant risk for Crohn's. If you'd experienced 2 or more infections in a year, in a 12-month period, then you've had a very significantly increased risk of inflammatory bowel disease later in life. But if you excluded measles virus infection or mumps virus infection, then that significance disappeared. In other words, it was these 2 infections together occurring within 12 months of the first 10 years of your life that were the crucial infections. Exclusion of the other infections actually strengthened the relationship between measles, mumps, and this statistical quirk reinforces the idea that it's these 2 infections that are the important ones. And for the statisticians amongst you, I'll show here the relative risks, unadjusted and adjusted, for Crohn's disease, really up at 6.38-fold increased risk of Crohn's if you'd suffered these two infections in the same 12-month period within your first 10 years of life, and for ulcerative colitis even greater, 8.51. And this was extremely interesting because it was a prelude to what we might expect with the use of live viral vaccines. Now, at the time, the single measles vaccine was available in the UK. There was no mumps vaccine. But similarly, we were able to look at children who'd been in receipt of the single measles vaccine and within a 12-month period had suffered natural mumps. In other words, was there an interaction between measles vaccine, the single measles vaccine, and mumps disease? And we found that there was a substantially increased risk for Crohn's disease after concurrent single measles vaccine and natural mumps infection, with a relative risk of over 10. So we went then to Iceland. Iceland is a fascinating country. It's an island population, and as we discussed earlier in these lectures, it is subject to a particular pattern of measles epidemics. So for most of the 20th century, Iceland was a relatively isolated country, and so distinct infectious disease epidemics were observed. The virus had to be reintroduced to the population to produce a further epidemic. Epidemics were recorded throughout the century in Iceland, and every patient with a diagnosis of Crohn's or ulcerative colitis has been identified. Now, what this graph shows is if you were a child growing up before the age of 5 who had experienced no concurrent epidemics with measles and mumps, 1 concurrent, 2 concurrent, or 3 concurrent epidemics with measles and mumps, then your risk of Crohn's disease in green or ulcerative colitis in yellow rises dramatically. In other words, the more likely that you are to be exposed to concurrent measles and mumps infections in Iceland, the greater your risk of subsequent inflammatory bowel disease. Now, it's fair to say that other studies were not able to replicate this finding. That didn't obviate the findings in the initial studies. It meant that there were some unanswered questions. Where does it stand now? Well, this naturally led to an interest in combination vaccines, since measles and mumps are given together in MMR. We were prevented from doing further research on this for various reasons. It seems that physicians in Croatia did not get the memo that this is off limits and did examine the relationship between MMR vaccination and inflammatory bowel disease. In 2010, they published a paper showing that MMR vaccination rates were higher in Crohn's disease patients at 90.3% compared with ulcerative colitis patients, and the controls with 74.8% and 67% exposure respectively, and this was statistically significant. And the conclusions are that MMR vaccination is significantly associated with Crohn's disease. So a fascinating observation, something that may be relevant to the epidemic of this disorder worldwide at the moment, certainly in developed countries, and something that may well be relevant to the combination vaccines, combination viral vaccines, where 1 + 1 + 1 does not equal 3. It may equal something completely different. So in summary, concurrent infection with measles and mumps has been associated with an increased risk of inflammatory bowel disease. MMR vaccination has been associated with an increased risk of Crohn's disease. Combining measles, mumps, and rubella may alter aspects of the immune response and the risk of adverse outcomes to these vaccines, and these concerns, which are relevant, highly relevant to live viral vaccines containing viruses such as measles, mumps, rubella, and latterly chickenpox, have not been adequately investigated.